At 1:55 a.m. on the St. Lawrence, the ship that could reach the Empress first was also the ship that had opened her side. The river was dark, busy, and almost blind. Two large ships had seen one another. Then the fog took the lights away. What remained was sound. Whistles, engines, the movement of hulls in a narrow working river. A fog signal, a whistle or siren pattern used when ships could not see one another, was supposed to replace sight with procedure. But procedure needs time. The Empress of Ireland did not have much of it. Within roughly 14 minutes of the collision, she would be gone. Out of 1,177 people aboard, 465 would survive. 1,012 would not. And the closest vessel to the dying liner was not a rescue steamer coming from shore. It was Storstad, the Norwegian collier whose bow had just cut into the Empress on her starboard side, the right side of a ship facing forward. The rescue was almost beside her. So was the wound. The Empress of Ireland was a Canadian Pacific liner on the Quebec to Liverpool route. She carried 1,057 passengers and 420 crew. They were not spread through the ship at random. They were arranged by class, work, fare, and deck. That arrangement mattered. The Canadian Museum of History later described the hard geometry of survival. Third-class passengers were quartered lower in the ship and had the least chance of escape. In calm conditions, class is a plan. On a listing ship, it becomes a map of who can reach air first. Families, workers, immigrants, Salvation Army delegates, and crew were inside that map as the liner moved downriver. On the bridge was Captain Henry Kendall. His track through the case is the outward track. A master leaving the pilot station, reading lights on a familiar river, and making decisions from a bridge that believed it understood where the other ship was. The Canadian inquiry later treated the first sighting as critical. The two ships had seen one another before the fog shut them out. On the Commission's reading, there was no collision risk at that stage if both vessels kept course. That is the first hard fact in the file. The river had not yet made disaster inevitable. Storstad was the second track. She was a coal-laden Norwegian collier inbound to pick up a pilot. On her bridge, First Officer Officer Toftenes had the watch that the inquiry would later examine. Two bridges, two sets of lights, two ships moving inside the same river. Then the lights disappeared. The case turns on what each bridge believed after that. A light seen a few minutes earlier can become a fixed idea. A ship that can no longer be seen can still be imagined in the place where it last made sense. That is where the danger begins. Before the fog closed in, the Commission's logic was stark. The ships did not need to hit if each kept course. The fatal risk came from the assumption that what had been seen would remain true after it could no longer be checked. This was not a river without rules. Article 15 defined the sound language. A steam vessel making way, meaning moving through the water under power, had one signal. A steam vessel stopped and not moving through the water had another. The Commission later found that both vessels complied with Article 15. That matters because it blocks the simplest explanation. The warning sounds were not simply absent. They were heard inside two different pictures of the river. Fog signals were a technical language for ships that could no longer see. But a signal does not think for a bridge. It arrives and officers have to decide what it means against the picture already in their minds. Here the warning was built into the rule itself. When a steamer heard an uncertain fog signal ahead, speed and certainty were supposed to leave the bridge together. Article 16 required moderate speed in fog. It also required a vessel hearing a fog signal forward of the beam, whose position was not ascertained, to stop her engines if circumstances allowed. That was the technical warning, not a prediction, a rule naming a dangerous condition. Sound ahead, position uncertain, visibility gone. It said that when a ship cannot see and cannot be sure, motion itself becomes part of the hazard. The Commission would later say the Empress complied with Article 16. It would not say the same of Storstad. The report expressed no opinion on Storstad's compliance with that article. That hesitation is small on the page, but large in the case. It leaves an open space in the most technical part of the warning. The two stories divide at the color of the passing. Port is the left side of a ship facing forward. Starboard is the right side. Red and green lights helped a bridge understand which side of another vessel it was seeing, and how the two ships were expected to pass. The Empress side said green to green. Storstad's side said port to port, the ordinary red to red understanding. The disagreement was not about color alone. It was about which side of the river each bridge believed the other ship occupied. The Canadian Commission came down against Storstad's account. It concluded that Toftenes was mistaken about the Empress intending a port-to-port passing. But once the fog removed the lights, neither bridge could simply look out and prove the other picture wrong. From that point, the ships were not only navigating through fog, they were navigating through memory. Ronald Ferguson, the senior Marconi operator aboard the Empress, becomes the third track. His station was not part of the navigation dispute, but once the collision came, his work became a race against the ship itself. The shore rescue system would depend on what he could send before the power failed. The Canadian Commission recorded that Ferguson sent the SOS slowly because he expected junior shore operators might be listening. That detail is practical, not ornamental. He was not sending for drama. He was trying to be understood. Father Point received the distress call. Eureka and Lady Evelyn were dispatched toward the scene. The message chain worked. The clock did not. A distress call is not rescue. It is only the start of rescue. Between signal and arrival, the ship still has to remain a place where people can move, climb, launch boats, and survive. The Empress was already losing that fight. The point of no return was not a shout anyone could replay cleanly afterward. It was the moment one bridge's assumption no longer matched the other ship's movement. Inside fog. The Canadian inquiry made responsibility turn on which ship changed course. It found against the Storstad version. Norway Heritage reports that a Norwegian inquiry later exonerated Storstad and Captain Thomas Anderson. The disagreement matters because this was not a disaster with one uncontested memory. My read is that the rescue failed before any rescue boat touched the water, because the only nearby rescuer first had to survive being the other half of the collision. Storstad was close enough to matter, but closeness was not readiness. Her crew had to understand the impact, separate from the liner, lower boats, and search in fog and darkness for people already in the water. The paradox is not that Storstad did nothing. The Canadian Commission said no complaint could be made of Storstad's rescue conduct. The paradox is that the vessel best placed to help was also the vessel that had helped create the emergency. Before the steel opened, the danger was still hidden in assumptions. Below the bridge, passengers were not reading lights or weighing rules. Many were lower in the ship, inside a class plan that would soon decide how far they had to climb. When Storstad struck, her bow hit the starboard side of the Empress near the boiler spaces. The Commission could not inspect the entire wound directly, but it reconstructed the damage from Storstad's injury and from the flooded compartments. The opening was large and below the waterline. Water entered both boiler rooms. That is the physical center of the disaster. A liner built around routes, compartments, crew work, and procedure suddenly had a wound that moved faster than those systems could answer. A watertight bulkhead is a sealed vertical partition. The Commission found that stability would have been preserved if the upper bulkhead doors bounding the damaged length had been closed, but actual conditions allowed water to spread. The ship listed. Once she listed, the disaster changed character. It was no longer only about a hole in the side. It was about angle, access, gravity, and time. This is why the lifeboat story is not the Titanic story. The Empress had boats and lifebelts. The Commission found them in good order. Their capacity was above the number aboard. Drills had been held, but equipment is not rescue by itself. Because the ship listed, portside boats became impossible to launch. Several starboard boats got away before the capsize, but the deck was no longer a stable platform. A lifeboat system needs time. It needs upright space. It needs routes people can reach. The Empress was surrendering all three. Below and inside, the class plan worked against the people furthest from open air. Passengers lower in the ship had to wake, understand, move upward, and find a route through a liner that was tilting and flooding. For many, the route closed faster than they could climb it. In the wireless room, Ferguson was inside the same collapsing clock. He sent the call slowly enough for shore to catch it. Then the power failed soon afterward. The system worked at the edge of its own disappearance. Message sent, shore alerted, lights and instruments about to be lost. Father Point had the call. Eureka and Lady Evelyn were ordered out. Outside the ship, rescue had begun. Inside the ship, time was almost gone. Within roughly 14 minutes, the Empress was no longer a vessel people could organize. She was a hull turning over in a dark river. 14 minutes is too short for the orderly sequence people imagine after an alarm. Alarm, movement, muster, boats, rescue. On the Empress, those stages collapsed into one another. The casualty math is blunt. Of 1,057 passengers, 217 were saved. Of 420 crew, 248 were saved. In total, 465 people survived out of 1,427 aboard. 1,012 people died. The crew survival number should not be turned into a simple moral verdict. Crew were working, some were higher in the ship, and some were closer to open decks or boats. Passengers lower in the class arrangement faced a different ship. More distance, fewer clear routes, and less time. Storstad had to search for the living after the ships separated. The Canadian Commission recorded that Storstad lowered 4 boats. Those boats made repeated trips. The search continued while living people could still be found. That corrects the version of the story that treats the collier only as the striking vessel. The Commission said no complaint could be made of Storstad's rescue conduct. That does not erase the navigation findings. It prevents the rescue phase from being flattened into accusation. The shore response worked as a message chain. It failed as a clock. Father Point received the SOS, Eureka was sent, and Lady Evelyn followed. But by the time Eureka reached the scene, the Empress was already gone. Eureka received about 150 survivors. Lady Evelyn arrived later. The wireless did not fail to call. The shore did not fail to dispatch. Storstad did not fail to lower boats. And still, the main event moved faster than all of them. The class plan of the ship became a survival map. The Canadian Museum of History states that third-class passengers, quartered lower, had the least chance of escape. Children were overwhelmingly lost, though even that count carries a small disagreement. The Commission's tables show 4 child passengers saved. The museum account states that 5 escaped death. That difference should not be smoothed away. Even in an investigated disaster, the human record can retain painful uncertainty. One child's name survives clearly in the museum account. Florence Lorraine Barber, 8 years old. The Canadian Museum of History records that she survived with Robert Crellin's help. That detail should stay within what the museum records. It is not proof that escape was available to all. It is one named survival inside a much larger pattern of children who did not get out. The Canadian Commission investigated the collision under a formal warrant and heard evidence in June 1914. Its scope was broad: responsibility, rapid sinking, life-saving appliances, wireless, and prevention. But its central navigation finding was narrow. The Commission treated the collision as a problem, of course: whistle, assumption, and compliance with the collision rules. It asked which ship changed course after the first sighting, and what each bridge did after fog made verification impossible. It concluded that Toftenes was mistaken about the Empress intending a port-to-port passing. It found that the Storstad side had acted on the wrong reading of the encounter. At the same time, the report was more careful than many retellings. It found both vessels complied with Article 15. It found the Empress complied with Article 16. It did not express an opinion on Storstad's Article 16 compliance. That leaves the case with a hard shape. The Canadian report assigns blame, but the fog does not become transparent just because a report has been written. The record does not support a simple story that no one tried. It supports something colder. There were boats, there was wireless, there was a ship on scene, and the failure still outran them. The Empress had life-saving capacity above the number aboard. Her lifebelts and boats were in good order. Drills had been held. Storstad lowered boats and made repeated trips. Father Point received the distress call and dispatched vessels. And still, 1,012 people died. The most dangerous myth is not always the one that invents neglect. Sometimes it is the one that assumes the presence of procedure means procedure can still be used. The Empress case does not allow that comfort. It shows a ship with boats that could not all be launched, a wireless call that could not buy enough time, a nearby vessel whose rescue role began only after its collision role had shaped the disaster. Afterward, memory did not settle cleanly either. The wreck near Pointe-au-Père later became protected cultural property, a legal recognition that the site itself carried historical weight. Public and museum framing has often called the Empress of Ireland Canada's Titanic. That phrase may help people understand the scale, but it can also pull the case toward a more familiar disaster than the record supports. The Empress was not simply another version of an Atlantic liner story. Its central mechanics were different. Collision in fog, a below-water opening near the boiler spaces, rapid flooding, severe list, and a rescue paradox built around the striking vessel. Nor did the verdict settle into one international memory. The Canadian report blamed the Storstad side of the encounter. It rejected Toftenes' account of the intended passing and made the collision depend on the wrong course assumption inside fog. Norway Heritage reports that a Norwegian inquiry exonerated Storstad and Captain Thomas Anderson. The Canadian record is open in detail. The Norwegian ruling reaches us here through a later report. I would not pretend the fog has lifted because one record is closer at hand than the other. Return to the St. Lawrence, then, as a place where sound carried farther than certainty. The rulebook could tell a captain what caution meant. It could define fog signals. It could require moderate speed. It could say that an uncertain signal ahead should drain confidence from the bridge and, if circumstances allowed, stop the engines. But the rulebook could not make both bridges share the same unseen river. It could not make a mental picture remain true after the lights vanished. It could not keep water inside the boundaries drawn for it if doors and routes allowed flooding to spread. It could not turn a nearby collier into a rescue steamer before that collier first became part of the wound. Between the findings sits the fog itself, not as an excuse. As the condition in which assumption became action, action became collision, and rescue began too late, even though it was almost already there. If the rescue was already there, and still 1,012 people died, what exactly failed in the fog? The men, the rules, or the record that tried to judge them?